Jenny thought Sumit was finally finding a way to bring them closer to America. Instead, she discovers that his plan could put the one thing they already have at risk, their home. And the real shock is not simply that Sumit needs money. It is that he has been looking into a serious loan connected to his US visa plans, and Jenny may not have known how far those conversations had already gone. That immediately turns this from a financial problem into a marriage problem. Because Sumit can argue that he is risking everything for Jenny. He can say he is trying to prove that he will do whatever it takes to make their future happen. But Jenny can look at the exact same decision and ask something much more uncomfortable. If Sumit is willing to make a decision involving their home when he feels desperate, what happens the next time he becomes afraid? That is the part of the story that matters more than the money. Sumit does not seem to view himself as reckless. In his mind, he is fighting for the marriage. He believes another delay could keep them apart longer, create more uncertainty, and possibly make Jenny question whether this move is ever going to happen. So, from his perspective, taking a risk may feel like commitment. But there is a dangerous difference between fighting for your marriage and gambling with your marriage. And Sumit may not realize he has crossed that line until Jenny forces him to look at what he is actually doing. The visa is no longer just paperwork to Sumit. It has become something much more emotional. It represents proof that he can follow through. Proof that he can choose Jenny without hesitation. Proof that after everything they have already survived, he can finally give her a clear answer about what comes next. That pressure matters. Because once somebody becomes convinced that one outcome absolutely has to happen, they can start treating every sacrifice as reasonable. At first, borrowing money probably feels simple enough. They need money. Their available savings are not enough. Sumit looks for another option. Then the amount gets bigger. The expenses become harder to manage. The lender wants stronger security. And suddenly the question is no longer, how much can we safely afford to borrow? It becomes, what do we own that can make this loan possible? That is when the house enters the conversation. And that is where this starts becoming frightening. Sumit is no longer only solving a money problem. He is putting emotional value on the sacrifice itself. The more difficult the sacrifice becomes, the more it may feel to him like proof that he is serious about Jenny. That is a dangerous mindset because love can turn into a competition against yourself. You stop asking whether a decision is wise. You start asking how much you are willing to lose. Jenny does not know that this is where Sumit's thinking has gone. At first, she only notices small things. Paperwork, phone calls, vague answers. Sumit keeps telling her he is handling something connected to America. Under normal circumstances, that probably would not sound suspicious. Their future already involves documents, expenses, waiting, planning, and uncertainty. Then Jenny sees the amount. And suddenly the questions start coming. Why is Sumit borrowing this much? Why was she not told earlier? How far has this process actually gone? And then she notices that property is involved. That is when the conversation changes completely. Jenny may be able to accept that money is tight. She may be able to accept another frustrating delay. She may even be able to accept that Sumit became scared and started researching options on his own. What she cannot easily accept is their home becoming part of that solution, without her being part of the decision. That is the emotional betrayal. When Jenny confronts him, Sumit tries to explain that the house is not simply being given away. It would only be used as collateral. But that explanation probably makes sense only to the person trying to justify the plan. Jenny hears something very different. She hears that if this goes badly, their home could be exposed. And once she understands that possibility, the word collateral does not make the situation sound safer. It makes the danger sound more real. For Jenny, the house represents something Sumit may be underestimating. Stability. And stability has never exactly come easily in this relationship. Jenny and Sumit have already dealt with family opposition, enormous cultural pressure, uncertainty about their future, and years of having to defend choices that other people did not understand. So imagine finally reaching a point where Jenny can look around and feel that at least one piece of their life belongs to them. Their home, their space, their security. Then she learns that the plan designed to take them toward a more secure future in America could threaten the security they already have. That contradiction is brutal. America was supposed to represent the next chapter. It was not supposed to threaten the chapter they already built. And I think viewers would split sharply over Sumit's decision. Some fans may look at him and see a man who is finally willing to put everything on the line for Jenny. After years of watching him struggle between his relationship, his family, cultural expectations, and outside pressure, those viewers may interpret this as Sumit finally saying, "Nothing matters more than my wife." But another section of the audience would probably see the opposite. They may say that commitment does not mean putting your partner's home at risk without asking them. And that is where I think Jenny has the stronger argument. Because commitment is not only measured by what you are willing to sacrifice. Sometimes commitment is measured by what you refuse to endanger. Sumit explains that he has considered other options. Their savings are not enough. Borrowing heavily from family could open another door they have spent years trying to close, because family money can come with family influence. Selling smaller possessions would not solve the whole problem. Waiting longer means more uncertainty. From Sumit's perspective, the house becomes the strongest thing he has available. On paper, you can understand how he gets there. Emotionally, that logic falls apart. Because this is not only Sumit's future being affected, it is Jenny's too. And when an asset represents the security of both people in a marriage, both people need to be included before that asset becomes part of a major financial gamble. That is the boundary Jenny feels Sumit crossed. Then she asks the question that exposes the biggest weakness in his entire plan. What happens if the visa does not work out? That question changes everything. Because Sumit has clearly spent a lot of emotional energy figuring out how to make the plan succeed. Jenny wants to know whether he has spent enough time thinking about what happens if it fails. What happens if the visa takes longer? What happens if another expense appears? What happens if repayment becomes harder than expected? What happens if Sumit borrows money based on a timeline that immigration does not follow? What happens if something completely unexpected changes their plans? That is where hope and planning become two different things. A real plan has to survive the bad scenario. It cannot only make sense if everything goes perfectly. And Sumit does not seem to have an answer that makes Jenny feel safe. That silence may be worse than the loan itself. Because when you ask your partner, what happens if this fails, and they do not have a convincing answer, you suddenly realize how much of the future has been built around hope. That is when Jenny's anger starts moving away from the money. Now she is thinking about secrecy, and that is much harder to fix. Money can be replaced. A loan can be stopped. Another financing option can be found. A visa strategy can change. But once you begin wondering whether your partner makes life-changing decisions first and tells you later, that doubt does not disappear when the paperwork disappears. Sumit says he did not want to worry Jenny until he knew whether the loan was actually possible. And I understand what he is trying to say. From his point of view, maybe he thinks there was no reason to create unnecessary stress over an option that might never work. But listen to how differently that sounds from Jenny's side. She may hear, "I wanted to see how far I could take this before I told you." That is not protection. That feels like exclusion. And this is one of the biggest contradictions in Sumit's position. He says everything he is doing is for Jenny, but the person he is doing it for was not fully included in the decision. That is the problem. People sometimes hide major information and tell themselves they are protecting their partner from stress. But if that hidden information can change both lives, protection without consent starts looking a lot like control. Jenny did not ask Sumit to stop fighting for their future. She asked to have a voice in that future. And Sumit may be so focused on proving that he chooses Jenny that he has accidentally created a situation where Jenny feels like she does not get to choose anything. Then comes the detail that makes the betrayal hit even harder. Jenny realizes this may not have been a random idea Sumit mentioned once and forgot. Documents connected to the property have already entered the conversation around the loan. Sumit insists nothing is final. Technically, that matters. Emotionally, Jenny is already somewhere else. Because once the property is being discussed seriously, this is no longer just Sumit thinking out loud. The idea has movement behind it. And that is why Jenny being heartbroken instead of simply furious feels more powerful. Anger says, "I hate what you did." Heartbreak says, "I never thought you would do this without me." That cuts much deeper. Jenny starts asking why Sumit could not simply tell her they needed more time. And that reveals something really important about how differently these two people define failure. For Jenny, another delay is frustrating. For Sumit, another delay may feel humiliating. Jenny can say, "We wait." Sumit hears, "You failed again." That may explain why he keeps pushing. He has spent years having his loyalty questioned. Will he choose Jenny? Will he stand up to his family? Will he follow through? Will he actually build the life he promised? At some point, Sumit may have started feeling like ordinary commitment was no longer enough. He needed to prove it dramatically. That is where the overcorrection begins. Instead of simply choosing Jenny, he feels like he has to demonstrate the choice with sacrifice. First money, then property, then risk. And where does that stop? If risking a little proves love, Does risking more prove greater love? If using savings shows commitment, does using the house show even stronger commitment? That is a trap. Because once love becomes a test of how much you are willing to lose, there is always another level. Jenny seems to understand that before Sumit does. A healthy marriage should not need increasingly dangerous sacrifices just to prove that the relationship is real. And that is why Jenny finally says something Sumit never expected. Stop. Not just reduce the loan. Not just negotiate better terms. Stop the visa process if protecting the house means they have to wait. For Sumit, that probably feels completely backwards. He has been telling himself that getting the visa is how he protects the marriage. Now Jenny is telling him that continuing down this path may be what damages it. That is a huge emotional reversal. But Jenny is not rejecting Sumit. She is rejecting the plan. There is a difference. Her message is basically, I want you in America. I do not want you there at any cost. That is probably the clearest way to understand her position. Jenny does not need another huge gesture. She does not need Sumit to prove his love by creating another crisis. She needs him to make her feel safe enough that the two of them can face a crisis together. And this is where the deepest relationship problem becomes obvious. Sumit seems to experience love through sacrifice. Jenny increasingly experiences love through stability. When Sumit takes a massive risk, he expects Jenny to see devotion.
Jenny sees danger.
When Jenny tells Sumit to slow down, she expects him to see maturity. Sumit sees another delay that might eventually cost him the marriage. They are both trying to protect the same relationship, but their methods are making the other person feel less secure. That is why this conflict cannot really be solved by simply canceling a loan. And then Sumit finally reveals what appears to be driving all of this underneath the surface.
Fear.
He is afraid Jenny will eventually get tired. Tired of paperwork. Tired of waiting. Tired of traveling. Tired of uncertainty. Tired of having to defend this marriage. Tired of living a life where the next chapter always seems one more obstacle away. And Sumit may believe that every additional delay gives Jenny another opportunity to decide she cannot do this anymore. Suddenly, the loan makes more emotional sense. Not financial sense. Emotional sense. It is not simply money to Sumit. It is his attempt to force uncertainty to end. And that is where I think this becomes less about immigration and more about abandonment. Sumit is trying to use money to solve fear. But you cannot finance emotional certainty. You can borrow money. You cannot borrow reassurance. You cannot mortgage a house and receive a guarantee that your partner will never leave. That is the mistake. When people become terrified of losing somebody, they sometimes stop asking, what protects our relationship? They start asking, what can I do right now to make sure this person cannot disappear? Those sound similar. They are not. Sumit wants to eliminate uncertainty. Jenny wants them to survive uncertainty together. That difference explains almost everything. Some fans may strongly sympathize with Sumit once they understand that fear. They may argue that after everything he and Jenny have survived, he is terrified that one final delay could become the breaking point. And that is understandable. But other viewers may say understanding his fear does not excuse the secrecy. I think that is the fairest place to land. You can understand why Sumit panicked without pretending the decision was healthy. Motivation explains behavior. It does not automatically justify behavior. Jenny can have compassion for why Sumit became desperate and still tell him that the house is off limits. In fact, one of Jenny's strongest moves is refusing to make the final choice for him. She does not want to drag him away from the loan. She wants Sumit to decide what matters. Continue chasing the visa through a plan that puts their home at risk, or protect the house and find another path. That puts the responsibility directly on Sumit. And this conflict is different from so many of their earlier problems because there is no easy outside villain. For years, Sumit and Jenny have had family pressure, cultural pressure, immigration complications, people questioning their age difference, people questioning their future. There has almost always been somebody or something outside the marriage creating pressure.
Not this time.
Nobody is forcing Sumit to use the house. Nobody is forcing Jenny to accept the loan. This is about how the two of them make decisions together. And that may actually make this more dangerous than another family argument, because you can blame an outsider and move forward together. It is much harder when the problem exposes something inside the relationship itself. Eventually, Sumit admits he went too far. He accepts that their home should never have reached this point without Jenny being fully involved. He agrees to step away from using the house as collateral and starts considering other ways to handle the financial problem. That sounds like the correct decision. But it is not a clean, happy ending. The immediate problem may be fixed. The house is safer. The loan can change. The visa dream can continue in another form. But Jenny now knows something she did not know before. She knows what Sumit can do when fear takes over. And that creates the next problem. What happens the next time he feels trapped? Does he come to Jenny first? Does he admit that he is scared? Does he say they need to slow down? Or does he quietly start solving the problem by himself until the solution becomes too big to hide? That is what Jenny will be watching. Trust is not only believing your partner will not lie to you. Trust is believing you will be included before the biggest decisions are made. Jenny needs future Sumit to talk before he acts. Sumit needs to understand that a sacrifice is not automatically romantic simply because it hurts. If the person you love never asked you to make that sacrifice, it can feel less like devotion and more like danger. And I would not expect this issue to disappear just because the house is taken off the table. The deeper conflict is still there. Sumit is still afraid time is working against them. Jenny is still craving stability. The visa still represents a future neither of them can completely control. So another delay could easily reopen everything. Maybe the next fight is not about a house. Maybe it is about another expense. Maybe family gets involved. Maybe the timeline changes. Maybe Jenny has to spend more time in America than Sumit expects. Maybe Sumit begins feeling pressure to prove himself again. Whatever the next trigger is, the real question will remain exactly the same. Can Sumit tolerate uncertainty without making another desperate move? And can Jenny trust him enough to believe he will involve her before the next major decision? That is why the biggest danger was never simply losing the house. The bigger danger was Sumit allowing fear to convince him that risking something belonging to both of them was acceptable if the goal was important enough. Sumit may genuinely believe he was making the ultimate sacrifice for Jenny. But Jenny never asked him to sacrifice their stability. She asked him to build a stable future with her. Those are two completely different things. So yes, the visa may still happen. The house may remain protected. Another financial option may eventually appear. But fixing Jenny's confidence in Sumit could take much longer than fixing any paperwork. Applications can be restarted. Financial plans can be rewritten. Loans can be cancelled.
Trust does not reset that easily.
And that is what makes this situation so much more serious than another disagreement about money. Jenny is not only wondering whether Sumit made a bad financial decision. She is wondering whether desperation changes the kind of husband he becomes. So if Sumit truly believed risking their home was the only way to reach Jenny in America, what do you think this really proves? Was Sumit showing the ultimate commitment to his marriage, or has his fear of losing Jenny become so strong that desperation is now making decisions for him? This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes.